Aloha, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening or morning, depending on where you're coming from. We have a very important topic to talk to you all today about, and that is Honor and Humanity, a Kamikaze Legacy Revisited. We have a great presentation lined up for you today. We'll be discussing the legacy of the Kamikaze and the pilots from both sides of history. For those of you that don't know, just 2 months ago, we commemorated the 80th anniversary of the infamous Kamikaze attack on the USS Missouri, which was followed by another infamous burial at sea by the crew members of the USS Missouri, made by the decision of Captain William M. Callaghan. Part of our speakers that are joining us today were here with us on that 80th commemoration, including Caitlin Callaghan and members of the Chiran Peace Museum. Before we get into introducing our speakers, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping rules just so that you can get your best viewing experience. We'd ask that you all kindly mute yourself during the presentation. There will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the program. If you have questions throughout the event, just feel free to drop them in the chat box and we'll go through a formal Q&A with those questions at the end of the program. You can set your screens to speaker view for your best viewing pleasure until the end when we do the Q&A. And lastly, sit back and grab a cup of coffee and enjoy the presentation. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Mike Carr, our President and CEO, to introduce today's speakers.
Good afternoon or good evening, wherever all you may be, and thank you for joining us today for our second of the year Mojo presentation, a very important one, and it's my honor to introduce our two presenters today. The first one will be Colonel Takeshi Kawatoko. Colonel Kawatoko is a retired colonel of the Japan's Ground Self-Defense Forces. He was born in Chiran and entered the National Defense Academy in 1959. And went on to serve with distinguish in the Japanese Army. He's now a bilingual docent at the Chiran Peace Museum, which is one of our two sister museums in Japan. And Colonel Kawatoko shares the stories of the Kamikaze pilots with international visitors, offering English language presentations that provide insight into military tactics, recruitment processes, and deeply personal farewell letters left behind by these young men, some of which are on display here at the battleship Missouri. Secondly, it's also my honor to introduce to you Caitlin Callaghan, who is a speechwriter and strategic communications expert with experience in both private and public sectors throughout the United States. In addition to degrees from Stanford and University of Oxford, she holds a PhD in medieval studies from Cornell University. She lives in San Francisco, and most appropriately, she is the great-granddaughter of the U.S. Naval Vice Admiral William Callaghan, who was the first commanding officer of the battleship Missouri and was the commanding officer during the Battle of Okinawa in April and May 1945. So if I will turn it over, I guess, to Colonel Kawatoko. Colonel, please.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm going to share the screen now, and I will explain with the PowerPoint. Okay? その前のやつを上のやつ。Introduction. Okay. As you introduced, I am Takeshi Kawatoko, a storyteller of this Peace Museum, which was previously the location of Kamikaze Air Base used during the II. Nice to meet you. 8 years ago, at the end of the World War II, Japanese fighter aircraft crashed into U.S. battleship. It was an unprecedented military fighting techniques. The pilots on the aircraft was called Kamikaze. Today, I'm very happy to have the opportunity to explain Kamikaze and how they came to be a part of Japanese society and how they came to be a part of Japanese, how they influenced Japan after the war. It will take about 25 minutes. The title of presentation is Mind of Kamikaze. After a short summary, I explain the military tactics of kamikaze and third, what kind of people became kamikaze. And last of all, explain the final letters written by kamikaze part with the episodes. Our Peace Museum exhibits many articles and writings. Left was the deceased soldier who gave their life to Japan during the final moment of World War II. The soldiers represented in this Peace Museum are those who died as Army kamikaze parts. They numbered 1,036 soldiers. And the Peace Museum has been built to mourn these parts and to expose the tragic loss of their lives, so that we all might better understand the need for peace and hopefully to ensure such tragedies are never repeated. The kamikaze operation was carried between March 26, 1945 and July 19, 1945. 4 months operation just before the end of the war. There are many bases for kamikaze parts in Kyushu area and the Taiwan area. Kamikaze attacks are usually carried as close to Okinawa. However, about half of them, 439 kamikaze took off from Chiran base because our Chiran base is nearest to Okinawa. Before these attacks started, a Chiran base had been set up 4 years earlier in December 1941 as a branch of Tachiari Military Python Training School, and it attended the military base kamikaze on March 1945. The base spreads just south of the Peace Museum. The Peace Museum, it's about 500 acres, a little larger than the Kagoshima International Airport. Originally, our Chiran town was very quiet town, prospered as a castle town. Now the many samurai had left in a corner in a Chiran town as the remains of a castle town. By the way, kamikaze means a big typhoon which is happened by baddest of WWII. About 800 years ago, Japan was invaded by Kublai Khan, the Mongolian fifth emperor. At that time, Japanese force was only on defense position because the preparation for defense was not so enough. However, one night, big typhoon happened, and many Mongolian battles sank into sea, and finally, Japan won a victory. From that time, Japanese people became to believe that big typhoon will happen in case of crisis or defense. That is called kamikaze. Kami means a divine or God. Kaze means wind. Wow, how the kamikaze attacked. This is one of the kamikaze aircraft, Army Type 1 fighter aircraft, Ki-43. Kamikaze aircraft carried about 550 pounds on your left wing and also carried a fuel tank, almost same weight on your right wing. The bomber is very big. It's about 6.6 feet long and its diameter is about 12 inches. The aircraft flew from Japan to Okinawa and then crashed into ship's aircraft carrier. When they crashed, pilot, bound, aircraft all became one. And when they took off, they knew they were heading to certain death. Wow, what kind of people became kamikaze? Please look at this picture. They are very young people. These three standing in the middle were 17 years old, 18 years old, and 19 years old, the same age of high school students. So people call them the young boy pilots. These young boys wanted to be Air Force pilots, and they joined the Air Force training corps when they became 14 years old after graduated elementary school higher course. They had been training 3 or 4 years in order to become kamikaze. They didn't know that they are going to be a kamikaze pilot during their training. However, once they are given the opportunity to join, they didn't hesitate. It's their duty. These pilots understood and appreciated the importance of their responsibility as their morale was very high. They believe that it will be worth dying for the future of Japan and for their parents. in those days. Almost every day, our Chiran town was bombed the U.S. Air Force. Now, I'm 85 years old this August. At the time, 5 years old. And even now, remember the harsh, terrible, and miserable everyday life we were forced to live in a shelter. With this TV station, they gradually became to think Japan might be defeated in war. However, we can't just watch and do nothing. Even if you can sink only one or two battleships, it saves the country and immediate family. I think this is also the mental education in those days. And the war will be ended before long. Then Japanese people lived in the shore to recover the developed from damages. As I explained, they took the station quite seriously, what we can't imagine today. And were thanking their parents, and indeed their lives very short. They survived hard. I think they made a 30 because they pray for the wonderful motherland will be built. And above all, they believe that people remained. 335 of young boy part died as kamikaze, and 269 university students died as kamikaze. They graduated from university earlier than usual. The total of these two groups was 604. As I said before, the total participants are 1,036. So I think you can say about 60% of the participants are those young people. The average is 21.6 years old. They had sympathized, especially Chiran Guardian School students who were still 13 to 15 years old. During the war, they helped the cooking, washing, and barracks cleaning at their base. And every time when kamikaze took off, they always watched and waved the kamikaze until aircraft disappeared. This is Chill Bosoms. He was Captain Anazawa, who died on April 12, 1945. The people around the airbase took care of them as best as they could. Well, last of all, is tell you the final letter written by Kamikaze pilots. Our Peace Museum exhibits about 6,000 kamikaze-related artifacts, including photographs, letters, and the final testaments. Maybe this is their last night. They put their material in order, and maybe that they wrote letter to his parents and friends. Well, here explain the contents of each kamikaze pilot memorial portrait. This is a picture, the name of unit, last name, first name, and their rank. This rank is after they died as kamikaze. The date of his death, home prefecture, and their ages. They are all officers, even though they were 70 years old. I think that is impossible in normal meter world that 70 years old became officers. That is the reason why they all became officers was due to the imperial order. In imperial order, it's also written, when officers died as kamikaze, they should be promoted by 2 grades. When non-commissioned officers died as kamikaze, they should automatically be promoted to second lieutenants. So in his case, before he died as kamikaze, his rank was corporal. After he died as kamikaze, he was promoted from corporal to second lieutenant. After jumped over sergeant, master sergeant, warrant officer. So he was given 4 promotions. Emperor gave them high-grade honor for their contributions to the countries. Well, we explained the 3 kamikaze pilot feared at the episode. This is the first one. He was second lieutenant Fujio Wakamatsu, 19 years old, when he died on June 3rd, 1945. His home prefecture is our Kagoshima prefecture. And this is a letter which refers to his mother. It is said that he wrote this letter at night before he took off to Okinawa. Very, very touching letters. English version. Dear mother, I have no complaints. I go smiling as I perform my first and last act of filial piety. Please put shrimp dumpling on my memorial shrine and praise me rather than crying for me. Please think of this all as me Fujio. Please take care of my elder sister, a brother, and elder sister, and younger brother Kazumi. In my haste, look at my writing. Please say hello to our neighbors. Dear mother, I, Fujio, go smiling to conquest. Be well, take care, see you, mother. Goodbye, Fujio. And when we say see you, we usually expect to meet each other again. However, this is his last letter, so he couldn't meet his family on us again. He wrote Dear Mother in the first part, and also he wrote again Dear Mother in the last part. There are many letters which are talked about the mothers instead of fathers. At the time in Japan, it was a male supremacy society. However, almost all of them respected their mothers. Their mothers had many, many babies and raised of them with love. The boys may have been naughty, and even when they couldn't communicate with their fathers well, they grumbled to their mothers about the situation. They probably realized how important their mother to them was the end of their force training. Their force training was very, very hard, and I think they might be very sorry that they couldn't do anything in return for their mothers. Some extol the emperors, such as long live our noble emperor. However, who they honored most probably was their mothers, I think. Well, second one. He is Lieutenant Colonel Yoshio Itsui, 32 years old when he died on April 1st, 1945. He was 32 years old, the oldest of all Kamikaze pilots. Besides the youngest one, was 17 years old. And the date, April 1st, was the day when U.S. force landed in Okinawa mainland and Kamikaze took off from Chiran Air Base for the first time. Of course, he was a commanding officer. And this is his last word. I have nothing to say. I only do my best. I think he wanted to insist. Until now, I've trained constantly about how to attack U.S. battleship. Now, I will end my brilliant military career to answer the expectation of Japanese people. After he died as a Kamikaze, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel from captain. He has 3 children, to a daughter, aged 4 and 2, and a son, 4 months old. The news that he died was reported to his wife. His wife went into terrible shock to hear the news and couldn't produce the milk for the baby. At the time, Japanese were very poor, so it's very difficult to get the food for the baby. So the baby died at 7 months from malnutrition. At the time, Japanese chased boys and girls because male supremacy society. So Lieutenant Colonel left his letter to his newborn son. And this is a letter which he left to his baby. This is the envelope of this letter. The name of baby was Yoshinori. English version. Dear Yoshinori, I leave these few words for you. In the spring of the 5th year after the outbreak of the Pacific War, I will fall with honor as a commanding officer of the 23rd Sympathized Squadron. I regret that I can't take you. However, I will keep my eye on you from heaven. Be dutiful to your mother, work hard, and please grow up to be an excellent as a Japanese man and the son of the emperor. When you grow up, feel free to pursue whatever carries to you. But just be sure not to bring shame on your father's good name along the way. Your mother has taken care of you through immense difficulties, so never forget her kindness. You must be a good son and try to make her comfortable. Be sure to take care of yourself and be of sound mind and body. From your father, for my son, Yoshinori. In the middle of his letter, he wrote, "When you grow up, feel free to pursue whatever calls to you. But just be sure not to bring shame on your father's good name along the way." I think he might have it the following. "In my days, it will be nothing but war. However, after war ends, Japan will recover from her wounds, and there comes many opportunities exist. Then Yoshinori, you should choose a career by yourself. Certainly it is free for everyone to choose a career today." In the later part, he wrote, "Your mother has taken care of you through tremendous difficulties. So never forget her kindness. You must be a good son and try to make her comfortable." When father died, mother became widow. It was very difficult to raise 3 children alone. So father wanted to Yoshinori to help his mother well after grow up. Lieutenant Colonel put this letter in this envelope and attached a short message with pencil. Let the boy read this letter when he's old enough to understand. However, he already at 7 months, so this envelope wasn't opened by himself. However, his 2 sisters, at the time aged 1 to 2, arrived today, and the memorial service for Kamikaze is held every May 30 in Chiran. They usually come to the memorial service, and they graciously donated this letter to a Peace Museum. So we can see it in the first corner in the main exhibition room. Well, last one. There was no fairy tales, only episodes. He was Captain Masaya Abe, 21 years old, when he died on May 4th, 1945. He was a graduate of Meiji University. Meiji University is a very famous private university. Though I said he died on May 4th, however, he once took off to Okinawa 5 days before from Chiran to Okinawa. However, he had to make an emergency on Kuroshima Island with engine trouble. After he landed safely, he found a small village on this island. There he found a Kamikaze pilot, Second Lieutenant Shinya Shibata, the classmates at the Officer Cadet School. Second Lieutenant Shibata took off from Okinawa on April 8th. However, he had to make emergency landing on Kuroshima Island with the engine trouble. He crashed when landing, and fire broke in the cockpit and seriously burning him. The people on the island attempted to nurse him. However, they didn't have the medicine for the burn, so Second Lieutenant Shibata did not recover well. When Captain met him, he said, "I'll return to Chiran. I'll get an aircraft and take off to Okinawa again as my mission. On my way to Okinawa, I'll fly over this from my island and drop down the medicine for you." However, the distance between Kuroshima and Kyushu is almost over 44 miles out of open sea, so it is obviously difficult to swim. Then Mr. Yasunaga, a farmer, at the time 21 years old, offered Captain Abe, "I'll fishing a boat with you." Then Mr. Yasunaga and Captain Abe rode and rode one night at Kutsu and southern shore of Kyushu. Then Captain Abe took off to Okinawa on May 4th, and he died. On his way to Okinawa, he flew over this Kuroshima Island and dropped down the medicine for the burn. Thanks to the medicine and the nursing of the people on the island, Second Lieutenant Shibata survived. After the war, he worked at the company and always said it was because of great export of Mr. Yasunaga and Captain Abe that I'm happy today, and he thanks them all the time. However, he passed away 1988 at 64 years old. Mr. Yasunaga, a farmer, had been very healthy. However, sadly to say, he passed away 2021, December 30 at 98 years old. So Canon farm friendship bounded between them. Well, that's all. That's all. However, I think most I explained the three Kamikaze part theater and episodes. However, What I think most striking in hindsight, they had a strong bond with the family and deeply loved them. This is a human element of war, which is often forgotten amid the battle on all sides. Peace and love shown through this war, and what is sadly inevitable spoils in human society. I believe one thing very strongly. We must not use a human as a bombs again. And I'd like to say, keep this world no more war. However, many countries are under war. On the other hand, Japan experienced much prosperity after the war. Japanese people, especially today's older people, worked very hard to improve these countries. And the result, Japan experienced much prosperity after the war. This is, I think that is Kamikaze part of desire. All they had thought about was devoting themselves to rebuild Japan. I think that's the reason why Japan is a strong economy and peaceful society. We must also seek the peaceful solution to disagreement between countries. And never forget the innocent people, citizens of humanity as one for important boast. Well, that's all. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I, again, appreciate you that you gave me such a wonderful time to explain Kamikaze. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kawatoko. We really appreciated that presentation. At this time, we'd like to invite Caitlin to share her screen for her portion of today's talk.
Okay.
Thank you, Colonel Kawatoko. It's an honor to give this presentation in partnership with you today. And I want to thank you and all of your colleagues at the Chiran Peace Museum for your work in sharing the history and memories of the young men of the Tokotai Special Attack Group, not only in Japan, but also with those of us in the United States. I'm one of the great-granddaughters of Captain William Callaghan, the first commanding officer of the USS Missouri, who later became a vice admiral. There were 5 admirals in our family, and 2 of them were brothers, William and his older brother, Daniel. William, who's on the left, and Daniel, who's on the right, liked to be called Bill and Dan, and that is what I will call them today during the presentation. Bill and Dan were 7 years apart, but they were close despite the age difference, especially as they grew older. Along with their 3 other siblings, they were the grandchildren of Irish pioneers who had come to California during the gold rush, and they grew up among lots of extended family in San Francisco and Oakland at the turn of the 20th century. Their childhood summers were spent in Yosemite National Park and the Santa Cruz Mountains, which they traveled to in a covered wagon. They lived through the 1906 earthquake, and they survived 4 years of mandatory Latin and Greek at their Jesuit high school in San Francisco. Bill and Dan were first inspired to attend the U.S. Naval Academy by their uncle James Raby, who was the first admiral in our family. At the academy, Dan played catcher for the baseball team, and Bill played for the tennis team. Dan graduated with the class of 1911, and Bill with the class of 1918, just in time to serve in the final months of World War I. In 1917, before Bill had graduated, his midshipman summer cruise had taken place on the USS Connecticut. This was one of the ships that Bill and other members of the Callaghan family had watched enter San Francisco Bay back in 1908 as part of President Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. That's the image you can see here of the ships steaming in a long line through the Golden Gate Strait, about 30 years or so before the Golden Gate Bridge was built. The Great White Fleet was traveling the world as part of a broader effort to build up and convey American naval power. And one outcome of this was the transformation of San Francisco from the gold rush city it had been when the Callaghan boys were born, to the major military and embarkation port it would become by World War II, one that was ringed by forts, bases, and naval shipyards. Another outcome was making Bill, like Dan, even more determined to make a lifelong career in the Navy himself. In the years between the 2 world wars, Bill and Dan both advanced through the ranks and spent months away from their young families. These shared experiences brought the 2 brothers even closer, and when they happened to be in the same place, they would make a point of spending time together. In the late 1930s, they were each stationed in Washington, D.C. Dan was serving as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's naval aide. In this photo, you can see Dan, on the right, next to the president who's standing next to the King and Queen of England who are visiting the United States. Eleanor, the First Lady, is a little bit harder to see, but she's standing next to the Queen. Dan's role was one that encompassed everything from delivering naval intelligence briefings to helping to hang the Roosevelt family's red Christmas stockings over the East Room fireplace of the White House. But after the president finished reading Dickens's Christmas Carol aloud, it was straight to Bill's house that Dan chose to go for Christmas dinner instead. By early 1941, when it was clear that the US would soon be at war, Dan asked his superiors to be released from that role and was ultimately given command of the heavy cruiser, the USS San Francisco. In acknowledgement of the Callaghan's Irish heritage, FDR actually signed the order on St. Patrick's Day in green ink. Dan was at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked on December 7th, 1941, and it was then that the course of his life and of Bill's changed profoundly. For Dan, that course would run through Iron Bottom Sound and the long fight for Guadalcanal. As many of you I'm sure know, the Guadalcanal campaign began in August of 1942 when Allied Marines landed in the southern Solomon Islands. Over the following months, there were about 10 major battles on land and at sea between the Allies and the Japanese for control of the island of Guadalcanal itself, including the massive naval battle that took place in mid-November. The battles were brutal and relentless, with high casualties, tremendous challenges for supply lines, and high rates of disease for both the Allied and Japanese forces. Dan, as commander of the USS San Francisco and also very briefly as chief of staff for Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, was kept moving constantly back and forth between New Caledonia, a key Allied deployment spot for the Solomons, and Auckland, New Zealand, which was the head of the campaign's supply lines. During those same months, Bill had been assigned to the staff of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. And in this photo, you can see Nimitz is in the center of the first row, and Bill is the tallest man in the back row. In late September 1942, Nimitz and some of his staff officers, including Bill, flew down from Pearl Harbor on an inspection tour of the South Pacific. In New Caledonia, Nimitz held a meeting with senior Pacific commanders, and Bill and Dan were briefly reunited. Later, Bill reported that Dan on that visit seemed very tired and worn out. It was the last time the brothers would ever see one another. A couple days later, Bill flew with Nimitz to Guadalcanal to see in person Henderson Field and the Marine-held perimeters on the island. On the flight over, the plane flew into thick cloud banks and the pilot became lost. Once the sea became visible again, every single person on the plane was tasked with looking out the window to try to identify the islands below. One lieutenant even pulled out a National Geographic map to try to match it to the island contours that they could see. Eventually, they managed to identify Guadalcanal and landed safely. This photograph was taken on Henderson Field the next day, prior to the group's return to Hawaii. On the night of November 13th, 1942, Bill was back at Pearl Harbor. But because he was on Nimitz's staff, he knew that on that day, Dan had been somewhere on the waters off of Guadalcanal in the middle of a horrific battle. That evening, Bill wrote several pensive lines to his wife, Helen, my great-grandmother. He begins with these words: "I'm terribly worried about Dan. Even before this reaches you, the worst news may have come. Of course, I can't tell you anything about what he's been doing, except to say that he's been in a battle. From what information is at hand, there's every reason to believe that he's either dead or seriously injured. I suppose I'll know by tomorrow, but ever since yesterday, the suspense has been terrible." Bill tries to make the letter a little bit more upbeat, asking his wife if people like the opening of the Second Front in Africa, and commenting that, quote, "the poor old French seem to be getting it from both their enemies and their friends," end quote. But he closes the letter with these words: "Maybe I'm unduly alarmed about Dan, as there's nothing positive yet, just a piecing together of certain facts which are indicative of what may be. So let us keep hope until I let you know the contrary. As we now know, Bill's suspicions were confirmed. Dan had been killed in a direct hit on the bridge of the USS San Francisco by the Japanese battleship Kirishima. You can still see where the shells went through on the bridge wings today. By some accounts, Dan had known even before the battle began that it was likely he and his men would perish. 70 years later, I was told by a survivor named Chief Johnny, who is very well known among members of the USS San Francisco Memorial Community, that on the evening before, Dan had walked the length of the cruiser, making a point of saying a word to all the sailors he passed, and instructing them to put on their best uniforms before the battle ahead. Across all the ships in the task force that the USS San Francisco had led into Iron Bottom Sound on November 12th, Dan had known personally not only many of the officers and men, but also their wives and families after years of shared naval service. Norman Scott, the other admiral killed in the engagement, had been one of Dan's classmates at the Naval Academy more than 30 years before. Together, he and Dan were two of the only 5 American admirals killed in the entire war. The naval battle was a strategic victory for the United States, but it was a devastating loss for many back in the United States. That's one of the reasons why the USS San Francisco is still remembered in its namesake city. Its bridge wings today form this monument on a cliff above the Pacific, with a compass point on the ground, marking the Great Circle Course route to Guadalcanal. I took this photograph on Memorial Day in 2022, during the 80th anniversary year of the Guadalcanal campaign, when the ceremony included a reading of the names of all who were killed on the cruiser that November night. And in December 1942, when the ship sailed home, one of the first to board was my great-great-grandfather, the father of Dan and Bill. A photographer from the Oakland Tribune captured his drawn and heavy face as he heard firsthand the account of the battle and his son's death. It was published on the newspaper's front page, right underneath photos of the cruiser, as it passed into the Golden Gate with all surviving hands on deck. For some time following Guadalcanal, Bill continued to serve on Nimitz's staff, and then he became the first captain of the USS Missouri. This command was one that he embraced, and as evidenced by the letters, photographs, newspaper clippings he saved, it formed one of the most meaningful experiences of his entire life. This is one of the clippings he kept of the Mighty Mo, which was published in the Washington Evening Star on November 13th, 1944, exactly 2 years to the day of Dan's death at Guadalcanal. It was on the deck of the Missouri that he received the Legion of Merit from Admiral Nimitz, as presented in this photo by Admiral Willis Lee. And it was on the bridge of the ship that images of Bill, like this one, have endured the longest in our family, where he seemed to feel most in his element and contentedly so. After the Battle of Iwo Jima in early 1945, the Missouri set course for Okinawa. The battle that began on Easter Sunday that year became one of the bloodiest in the Pacific, with more than 300,000 people killed, local civilians, Japanese, and allies. As many of you know, it was not long after that battle began that a kamikaze pilot named Setsuo Ishino in a Zero fighter jet took aim on the USS Missouri. He flew towards the ship's starboard side from the stern, but his plane, when it struck the deck, broke in half. Ishino was killed on impact, and the 500-kilogram bomb his plane had carried fell into the Pacific. Flames from the burning gasoline were put out by the Missouri crew, and then, as they prepared to remove the pilot's remains, the commanding officer ordered them to stop. They were told by Bill to bring the deceased pilot down to sickbay to prepare him for a full military burial at sea. The following morning, Flight Petty Officer Second Class Setsuo Ishino was given that full military burial, complete with pallbearers, a volley of rifle fire, and a Japanese flag handmade by a member of the USS Missouri crew. 10 years ago, I spoke about this event, which is still little known in the broader history of the World War II battles of the Pacific, to a group of students at the same Jesuit high school in San Francisco that Bill, Dan, and my own siblings and I all attended. At the time, it was the 70th anniversary of the Battle of Okinawa. More of the survivors of the war on both the Japanese and Allied sides were still alive then, including a man named Kaname Harada, a Japanese veteran who was known as the last surviving Zero pilot. He had been wounded at Guadalcanal and spent the last decades of his life speaking out frequently about the horrors of war. When I spoke to the high school students, I raised the question of how difficult it can be to make a decision that's morally right in the moment, and how with hindsight, that decision may seem like it should have been easy, or at the very least, very clear-cut. But Bill's decision to honor Ishino as a fellow warrior was not universally seen as the morally correct decision to make. It bothered some of the Missouri crew members, and it still bothers some Americans who learn about it in our present time. I find it interesting that Bill, who, as I mentioned, saved so many letters and clippings and photos of his time on the Mighty Mo, he never talked about this particular decision. From what we know of him, it's not because he thought the decision was the wrong one, but because it was so clearly right that it did not need to be noted or explained. Its very unremarkableness to him makes it remarkable to me and our family today. Decades later, when Bill died and this story came to greater light, many of us came to see this decision within the fuller picture of his life as a whole, as did a member of his Bible study group, who wrote this letter to the Washington Post in April 2001 and cited Bill's abiding Christian faith and reservoir of compassion. When I reflect on this story, I think about something Bill said in his first speech to the first crew of the Missouri at the ship's commissioning in New York in 1944. As he told those men, their duty ahead lay not just in being true to their country, their families, and their God, but as he said, I ask that you be true to yourselves. That today is the light in which I see Bill's decision to honor Ishino, that it reflected him upholding his own duty to be true to himself and his own moral creed. After the war ended, Bill ultimately became commander of U.S. Naval Forces Far East. In that role, he and my great-grandmother moved to Japan, where they lived in friendship with the Japanese people. On various occasions, Bill would speak about the shared purpose and partnership of the two countries, as he did in this speech in 1956, honoring their mutual trust and mutual strength on the anniversary of Commodore Perry's visit to the country in the 19th century. The friendship which sprang from the seed he planted has grown in the last decade as never before, Bill said. Let us wish that it will last 1,000 years. That sentiment of friendship was often reciprocated. One of the gifts Bill received in Japan was this plaque. The words, as they've been translated into English for the Callaghan family, acknowledge the death of Dan in the naval battle at Guadalcanal, recognize Ishino's attack and respectful burial on the USS Missouri, and thank Bill for his subsequent actions with respect and love. That friendship also has been extended to subsequent generations of the Callaghan family. Nearly 25 years ago, when members of our family visited the Missouri to commemorate Bill's decision to honor Ishino, they were joined by the descendants of 3 Japanese pilots, one of whose identities at the time was thought to be that of the pilot who attacked the battleship. This was prior to the positive identification of Ishino by researchers. One of those descendants made paper cranes for the descendants of Bill, and these 2 were given to me. They are among my most treasured possessions. 80 years after the end of the war, I'm grateful that these stories are still passed from generation to generation and still present for all of us in spaces of peace that are open to everyone. These include places in the San Francisco Bay Area that were once fortified military installations and are now public lands and monuments, where anyone can visit the bridge wings of the USS San Francisco above the Pacific, or one of the original guns from the USS Missouri, which overlooks the approach to the Golden Gate, or of course, the Battleship Missouri Memorial itself at Pearl Harbor, as many of us in the Callaghan family were honored to visit this past April. My great-grandfather Bill was fortunate to live a very long and full life, long enough to know 3 subsequent generations of his family. In a full arc, he lived from the beginnings of a time of World War to an era in which military spaces became national parks and museums, and former enemies became friends. In later years, Bill often saw and wrote to those who had also served on the Missouri. In one of those letters, he wrote these words: I have a British admiral friend who told me some years ago that he was never particularly ambitious to become a flag officer. What he truly enjoyed were individual command assignments afloat. Bill admits, while I cannot quite subscribe to his denial of a desire for flag rank, I must agree that the most satisfying part of a naval officer's career is command of a ship. In that respect, my service on the Missouri is still a vivid one to me, because it was during war and actual combat. Bill was 93 years old when he died, nearly half a century after his older brother Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was amazing. We really appreciate the perspectives that you offered alongside Mr. Kawatoko. At this time, we are welcoming our questions from our audience, so please feel free to drop your questions in the chat room and we'll get to them as soon as we can. I'll start it off with just a couple of questions that I have. The first one going to Mr. Kawatoko, and that is, why did the wartime government of Japan decide to use the kamikaze during the war, and where did the idea come from?
As the kamikaze attacks first adopted by Navy in October 1944, at Leyte Island operation in Philippines. Navy Air Force at the time disadvantage aimed to sink U.S. battleship by Air Force direct hitting rather than dropping bomb to quickly turn the tides of battle. And in Okinawa, not only Navy, but also Army Air Force participated because Okinawa was a front line of mainland and aimed to gain the time in preparation for the decisive battle of mainland.
Thank you. I'll shoot this next question over to Caitlin. What inspires you to keep telling your great-grandfather's story today, 80 years after World War II?
I think, especially as I grow older myself and realize that so many of the people who lived through the war have passed, even in the last 10 years from when I first spoke about this particular event. As someone who never grew up in a period of total war, like Colonel Kawatoko talking about being a 5-year-old at the end of World War II, I think it's very important for those of us who have not had that experience but are receiving these stories to then make a point of passing them on and teaching them as well. And I think that brings out the best of what it means to be an American in that regard, to share that history with others. And I'm very proud to have a role in sharing that responsibility.
That's great. Thank you. This next question is from our chat room for Mr. Kawatoko. In regards to Callaghan's decision to honor and recognize Ishino's death, how was that viewed by the Japanese forces, and was it well known at the time?
Kawatoko さん、天下水りのひとみです。
お願いします。
天下水りに石野さんがパイロットが衝突したお話、その当時はどのようにその日本の軍の方たちはその吹奏が行われたということに対して何か反応があったのかっていう質問をちょっと受けてるんですけれども、よろしかったら英語でおそらくその当時は知られていなかったと思うんですが、お答えいただけましたら。
いやー、それは全く分かりません。申し訳ないんですけれども、はい。おそらく上層部は、分かっていたと思うんですけれども、国民には知らされてないと思うんですね。はい。通訳をお願いします。ひとみさんの方で。
He said probably some of the Japanese forces knew about this event, but he's not sure because it wasn't announced to the Japanese, the national, any like a radio or nothing informed. So he's not sure about it.
Thank you. And you're hearing from Hitomi Ferranda. She is our Japanese sales manager at the Battleship Missouri and extraordinaire with interpretation. So thank you for being here with us today, Hitomi. We have another question in the chat room for Caitlin. One of our guests is interested in you sharing the connection again with the Battleship Connecticut.
Yes, so the Connecticut was part of the Atlantic Fleet, Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet that entered San Francisco Bay in 1908. And my great-grandfather Bill, along with many other members of the Callaghan family, had gone to watch the Great White Fleet come in. And that was one of the ships they saw. And then about 9 years later, during his midshipman summer cruise in 1917, the Connecticut was the ship that he was assigned to. So there was that special connection for him.
Got it. Thank you. Back to Mr. Kawatoko. What was going on in the mindset of the pilots that enabled them to carry through with this mission?
According their will notes, they expressed their strong will to complete their mission as Kamikaze pilots and apologized for not being able to take good care of appearance and stated that the kamikaze attacks was the only way that they could repay their parents' respects and love for wife and children, and also they express their gratitude to those who looked after them. That's all.
Thank you. One of our guests in the chat room also recently read a book, Memoirs of a Kamikaze. And for many years, this author had kept his service as a kamikaze pilot a secret. Did you find this to be the case of other pilots as well?
ひろみさん、トランスレートお願いします。
はい、すみません。ちょっと質問を確認しております。この方は神風に関する本を読まれたそうなんですけれども、その、一人の神風の、パイロットの方が、その神風であることをずっと秘密にされていたそうなんですが、他のパイロットの方も同様に、生きて帰られたりされた際には、ずっと秘密にされるというようなことはあったんでしょうか？
神風で、途中の島で、不時着をしたりして帰ってきた人もおりますし、それからそのまま戦争が終わるまで島で過ごした方もいますけれども、戦後になっていろいろと事情が変わって神風そのものに対する価値観といいますか、それが変わってきましたので、中には神風であったということを伏せていた人もいると思います。ただ、戦時中は神風というのはもう国を守る最大の力を持っていると自分たちも信じてましたし、また特攻隊員もそれぞれの、気持ちを持っていたと思います。
戦時中はその神風ということを隠さずに、ただ、
秘密、神風であるということをやっぱり例えば家族の人とかには知らせてないですよね。はい。それはもう軍として神風のパイロットであるということを知らさないようにしてましたので、なんとなく、意識した人もいるでしょう。ただ、遺書を読むと、彼らはやっぱりもう神風として出撃をしますと強い意志を表していますので、やっぱり何らかの形で知らしていたと思います。
As an imperial mission that they had to keep the secret as a kamikaze pilot, so even the family didn't know, but some family through the last letter, or some family might know a little earlier their departure, their final mission, but most of them was in secret.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Another question from our chat room. This is directed for both of our speakers. She's curious to know, what are some of the young people's reactions to these events that occurred now 80 years ago? Do you recall a particular response from the talks that you've given, both as a docent and then in your speeches, Caitlin, that you've delivered to your previous high school?
I will say, when I spoke about this 10 years ago, most of the students I spoke with seemed to feel without any equivocation that my great-grandmother had made the right decision. They didn't really understand maybe why it was contentious, because it was presented to them perhaps, or taught in a way that made it seem like that was sort of a foregone conclusion. So actually part of that speech was explaining to them a little bit more about the context of the war and that particular battle, which I know Frank and other staff members at the Missouri have also done, to explain how intense and overwhelming that experience was, and then all of a sudden shift to this decision to honor a pilot like Ishino when this happened. So interestingly, it's maybe not what I would have expected to hear. And so part of that piece was sharing that broader context of the war and what that particular battle had been like.
Thank you. Hitomi, do you want to translate for Mr. Kawatoko?
Oh, sorry, Jacqueline, I lost the question. What was the question about? Sorry.
Just in his delivery today as a bilingual docent at the Chiran Peace Museum, what are some of the reactions that you get from younger audiences to these events that occurred so long ago?
川床さん、知覧特攻平和会館で、この過去にあった出来事っていうこの特攻であったりですとか、そういう神風がミズーリに衝突した出来事であったりですとか、そういうものを最近の若い方々っていうのはどのように受け取られているのかっていうのを少しちょっとお聞かせいただけたらと思うんですが。
はい。一つは、やはり国を守るために、ここまで本当に一生懸命になって国のことを思って体当たりをしていったということに対して、非常に尊敬の念を持っている若者もいますし、それからそこまでやる必要なかったんじゃないかという両極端の感想を持っている若者もいます。ただ、この特攻隊員たちの書いた遺書、手紙が平和会館にたくさんありますので、それを若い人が読むと、やはり自分たちの今の生き方がこれでいいのか、やっぱり特攻隊員の心に学ぶところも非常に多いんじゃないかということで、レピーターもかなり増えています。お願いします。
Some of their visitors, the young generation, respect the kamikaze pilot who fought to protect their country, but at the same time, also, it shouldn't have been the Toko mission. There are so many letters, the final letters at the Chiran Peace Museum, so that young visitors rethink how they have to live for the rest of their life through the letters. So many people coming back and then read the letters again.
Thank you for that. Caitlin, back to you with another question. In contrast to a question that we asked earlier, what was the reaction of Captain Callaghan's superiors after his decision to honor and recognize Petty Officer Ishino?
That is an excellent question, and I don't actually know the answer. I will say that one way or the other, the decision doesn't seem to have affected his career after that point. He advanced for the remaining, 12 or 14 years that he then spent in the military pretty highly. So whatever they thought, it didn't seem to negatively impact the rest of his time in the Navy.
Thank you. And I know we're getting short on time here. I think we've gone through most of the questions in our chat room, so I'll leave you both with one final question. You've both made it somewhat your career, if not your own legacy, to continue to share these stories that happened historically 80 years ago. What is it that you want to leave with our viewers today, just as they carry on for the next generations to come, and as we are about to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of the war here in September?
I will just say that I personally feel very honored that I get to play a role in telling this part of a much bigger story of the war and the legacy that infected all of us who grew up in its aftermath. And my hope is just that stories like these are not forgotten and that each generation takes up that responsibility to keep them alive for the generations that come after.
Thank you. Mr. Kawatoko, did you want to add anything to that with regards to the legacy of the storytelling you're leaving behind at the Chiran Peace Museum?
はい、川戸さん、今日の締めくくりのような形になりますけれども、最後に聞いていただいた方たちに80周年という節目に何かさらに伝えたいこと、一言何かございますでしょうか。
はい。私たちはこういう歴史を今、皆さんに知ってもらいほしいということで、いろいろと工夫をしております。特に若い方々にたくさん平和会館に来ていただいて、特攻隊員の心を理解して、それをこの普及をするということも大切ですし、それから外国の方々もぜひ このチランの平和会館に来ていただいて、実際に特攻の心といいますか、遺書手紙を読んでいただいて、理解をしていただけたら大変ありがたいです。
As a commemorate of 80th anniversary, Chiran Peace Museum will continue to promote, especially to the young generation, and at the same at also the foreign countries, the visitors. They hope to come visit their museum for future.
Great, thank you. I think that about concludes our talk today. I want to thank both of our speakers, Caitlin Callaghan and Mr. Tawakoto, for your presentations today. They've been wonderful. For those of you that are interested in learning more about the Kamikaze attack on the USS Missouri, as well as the kamikazes themselves and the famous burial at sea that happened afterwards, we do have all of our videos from our 80th commemoration events on our YouTube channel. We will share those out with a short survey and links to today's presentation if you wanted to watch back any of that. And we can answer any more questions that you have. We also invite you to visit our online exhibit. It's exclusive to artifacts about the Kamikaze events that have never been on display before that you can only view online. Those are all available on our website at ussmissouri.org. And most of all, we wanted to just thank you all for joining us for today's presentation of Mojo. We encourage you to stay connected with us through social media or connecting with us online or enjoying our Scuttlebutt newsletter. Thank you to the Old Salt Coffee Company, who is our sponsor for this series and makes it all possible. And we encourage you to join us again for our next event. Again, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, Mr. Tawakoto, for your wonderful presentations today. And thank you all for joining us. Aloha.
Aloha.
Thank you very much.